and evolutionary biology at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. He has a doctorate in genetics from the University of Ferrara in Italy and a doctorate in botany from the University of Connecticut. He has been a postdoctoral associate at Brown University. His academic research focuses on the ecology and evolution of genotype-environment interactions, that is, on the old nature versus nurture problem. He has published 48 technical papers in evolutionary biology. He has written 2 popular science books in Italian, The Romance of Life, on evolution for high school students, and The Road to the Stars, on the exploration of the solar system, co-authored with Franco Foresta Martin. Sinauer just published his technical book, Phenotypic Evolution, a Reaction Norm Perspective, co-authored with Carl Schlichting. And he is preparing Phenotypic Plasticity, Beyond Nature versus Nurture for Johns Hopkins University Press. He has been awarded the prestigious Dobzhansky Prize by the Society for the Study of Evolution, has twice won the Oak Ridge National Laboratory Science Alliance Research Award, and has been selected as Teacher of the Year by the University of Tennessee Mortar Board Faculty Appreciation Committee. As a skeptic, he has debated creationist Dwayne Gish and Christian theologian William Craig, has given talks to various skeptic and humanistic groups throughout the United States, and has published in Skeptic and Skeptical Inquirer. He is editor of the online skeptical magazine Reality Check. The negative proposition is debated by Dr. Dwayne T. Gish. Dr. Gish received a Bachelor of Science degree in biochemistry from the University of California at Los Angeles, a doctorate in biochemistry from the University of California at Berkeley. He was elected to the UCLA chapters of Phi Beta Kappa and Phi Sigma Upsilon, a chemical honorary fraternity. He has spent a total of 18 years in biochemical research, with 3 years at Cornell University Medical College in New York City, 4 years with the Virus Laboratory, University of California, Berkeley, and 11 years on the research staff of the Upjohn Company, a pharmaceutical firm, Kalamazoo, Michigan. During that time, Dr. Gish worked with 2 Nobel Prize winners. In 1971, Dr. Gish left his position with the Upjohn Company to join Dr. Henry Morris in his present work with the Institute for Creation Research, where he has served as Associate Director and Vice President. He has published approximately 40 technical articles in scientific journals. He is the author of numerous articles and several books on the subject of scientific evidence for creation. He has participated in nearly 300 debates and has lectured in 49 of the 50 states, in most provinces of Canada, and in about 30 foreign countries. He is a member of the American Chemical Society and is a fellow of the American Institute of Chemists. He is one of the founders and a board member of the Creation Research Society. He is married and has 4 children and several grandchildren. The order of battle. The affirmative, 60 minutes. The negative, 60 minutes. A 5-minute break. The first affirmative rebuttal, 15 minutes. The first negative rebuttal, 15 minutes. Affirmative conclusion, 5 minutes. And negative conclusion, 5 minutes. Questions from the audience, 45 minutes. The debate is concluded by 10:45. Audience, state your questions briefly and refrain from extraneous statements or commentary. Direct your questions to the affirmative or the negative. The moderator will read the question for answer, comment, and additional comment by one. Please withhold your applause until each speaker completes. An audience, please refrain from approaching the debaters during debate. They will be preparing in that time their rejoinders. The affirmative, 60 minutes. You may begin.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me here. It's a lovely place. It's very different from the churches where I grew up in Rome, in Italy, but I recognize the same general feeling. And I'm very pleased to be here. This is the third time that I debate Dr. Gish in public. And actually, we never debated in private, so this is it. And I will try to make my case, hopefully in a little less than an hour, because I know that these debates can be taxing not only on debaters, but on the audience as well. There is a lot to be said, unfortunately, so I'll try to be brief. Let's start with the slides. Do I have control of the slide projector? I guess I do. Yes, I do. Can we get the slides to fit the screen a little better? Now the focus is fine. Well, meantime, I'll go ahead. You'll miss something, but not a lot. First of all, let me make clear why I'm here and what is the spirit in which I'm here tonight. And that spirit is well summarized by a phrase that was uttered long ago by a philosopher named Spinoza. He said, "I have made a ceaseless effort not to ridicule, not to bewail, not to scorn human actions, but to understand them." And this is exactly the spirit that I'm here tonight. I don't want to make fun of anybody. I don't think there is anything funny about the whole thing. There is a lot of interesting stuff to be discussed, but certainly not make fun of anybody. And I have the utmost respect, and not only for the audience, but of course for Dr. Gish in particular. That said, let's get to the fireworks. First of all, debating evolution and creation in one evening, it's a large task. And in fact, it's an overwhelming task. Because it's not just about debating creation and evolution, it's about debating a lot of other things. We'll be debating the nature of science tonight. To some extent, we'll debate also the nature of religion. Now, you understand that those are fairly large topics that cannot be covered entirely in one evening, especially in front of a general audience. This is not a classroom, so I cannot assume that anybody here knows a lot about either of these topics. But let me start with discussing what is science to begin with, in a couple of slides only. The goal of science is to present the best of our understanding of how nature works. That is, science is not concerned with the truth in the sense of the absolute knowledge of nature. Scientists believe that it is very difficult, if not impossible, to get to the truth by empirical means, and therefore the best we can do is to present our best understanding of how things are and work. Every scientific conclusion, therefore, is tentative, and it's taught only until we know better. That's what I do with my students at the university. That's what every conscientious teacher in every school on the planet does. Okay, we teach the best of what we know, but only until we know better. And often enough, we know better after a while. Why should we use science in order to uncover the truth about the natural world, or at least the best, making our best guesses about the natural world? Philosophers have written tons of pages on this question. I have philosopher friends, and so I respect their work, but I don't particularly like philosophy because it sounds like after a while you keep talking and talking and not making any headway. My answer is very simple. It works. Most of you came here tonight with a car. I came here with an airplane, so did Dr. Gish. Some of you may have cellular phones. I'm sure almost everybody has a television or a VCR or things of that sort. Well, the only reason you got those things, I have a laptop computer right here with me, is because of science and because science works. If it didn't work, you wouldn't have those things. If something else was a better way of uncovering truth about the natural world, we will have that other way of doing things. So the only reason that I'm submitting here to use science to uncover truth about the natural world is simply because it works. I don't have any agenda, any other philosophical agenda about it. If it doesn't work, then we'll look for something else. But so far it has worked quite well. So let me start going through a series of general statements that creationists make. These are statements that you can find either in the writings of Dr. Gish or in the writings of other creationists that I have been perusing in the last few months since I got involved in this thing. One common statement is that evolution is just a theory, and therefore why should we believe what is just a theory? Well, the trick there is that there is a fundamental distinction between a theory in the vernacular sense, in the everyday language sense of the word, as, you know, it's a hunch. Well, it's just a theory. It's not more than a theory, or so on and so forth. And the scientific meaning of a theory. In science, a theory is a pretty complex matter. It's usually expressed in mathematical terms. It relies on a lot of evidence. It summarizes a lot of evidence, and it makes predictive statements about phenomena, natural phenomena. So you can't dismiss evolution on the basis that it's just a theory, because it isn't just a theory. It is a scientific theory. Other examples of scientific theories, which I'm sure you wouldn't dismiss that easily, are gravity, the theory of relativity, and the Copernican theory that says that the Earth rotates around the sun and not the other way around. Okay, so those are other examples of scientific theories, and evolution is exactly on the same level as on this one. Another common statement that is made by creation is that evolution is a theory, not fact. So, okay, now we know that it is a theory. Is it also a fact? Well, it depends on what you mean by fact and what you mean by theory. There are a lot of facts out there that support the theory of evolution. So in that sense, evolution is a series of facts. Of course, those facts can be interpreted in different ways. If you define evolution simply as change over time, as some people do, then evolution is a fact. There is nothing, nobody can actually deny that. You look at the fossil record and that's what you see. You see some kind of organism at one point in time and other kinds of organisms at another point in time. So things change. So from that point of view, evolution is a fact. How does that happen? It's a different matter, and that is where the theory comes into play. But let's look at some of the facts. The fossil record. We see in the fossil record a progression from simpler to more complex forms, which is summarized. I'd like to thank all those who made it possible for me to be here tonight. And you can see there from primitive men to dinosaurs all the way down to fishes and other things. Now, if the fossil record presents a progression from simpler to more complex things, that to a scientist is the hallmark of a natural process. Okay, things happen in nature more or less, with some exceptions, but happen in nature pretty much gradually. Now, the speed of this graduality is a matter of debate, and we will get to that in a second. But things don't just appear out of nothing if it is a natural phenomenon. Another fact about evolution is provided by what is called biogeography, that is the study of the distribution, the geographical distribution of animals and plants. For example, you can see over here two series of, well, I don't know if you can see them, but there are two series of animals, one over here and one over there. This is two different columns. These organisms live in two complete different parts of the world. These are African animals, these are Australian animals. But they're very, very similar to each other. That is, this one matches with this. It's the same kind of animal. It's a predator. It looks like a big cat. And so on and so forth. These are both insect-eater animals, and they both look like rodents, like rats. These both look like squirrels, and these both look like dogs. Except that this is a real squirrel, this is a real rat, this is actually a real dog. These are the Australian equivalent of those animals. Now, we all know that Australians do things in a kind of a bizarre way, maybe because they're upside down. But the point here is that these organisms evolved independently. They appeared gradually through time independently in Australia as opposed to being in Africa. Why did that occur independently? Because the two masses of land were not unified, they were separated for the last few hundred millions of years, which is when these organisms starting to appear. That kind of pattern is consistent with an evolutionary interpretation. A third fact about evolution, or that is consistent with the theory of evolution, is that Every living organism is made of the same materials, or variation on the same materials. Everybody has DNA, proteins, and things of that sort. This is a molecule of DNA. This is a model of a molecule of DNA. That, to a scientist, points to common origin. Things were not just put into places at random, like we've seen with the biogeography argument, and things are actually related to each other. They're made of the same things, another hallmark of a natural phenomenon. Another fact about evolution: closely related species look very similar. If you look at the DNA of some species that scientists think of as closely related genetically and therefore evolutionarily, for example, lions and tigers, okay, they have a very similar DNA. To a scientist, what that means is that they share a relatively recent common ancestor. How did we come up with this idea? Well, it's the same situation when you have humans and you can tell the children of a couple, children that are not of that couple, okay? Because they look more similar to them. Okay? And why do they look more similar to them? Because they share a higher amount of their DNA with their parents than they share on average with anybody else in the community. So the same way in which to some extent you can tell descent in humans, and if you want to be precise, of course, you don't just look at how people look at, but you can look at their DNA. Okay? You've heard of DNA evidence now being admitted in court for the same purposes. Well, that's exactly what an evolutionary biologist does. Pretty much the same thing. We look at different species and we realize that some species are more similar in their DNA, not only in their appearance, but in their DNA, in their molecular machinery, to other species than they are to a third species. And therefore, the inference, the logical inference, the plausible inference is that the two that are more similar to each other came from a more common recent ancestor than the others. Now, since this pattern is repeated over and over for millions and millions of species, okay, and it always holds, that's a pretty good argument in favor of a natural process that has changed organisms over time, which is what evolution is. Another fact about evolution is that natural selection, and we'll talk about natural selection again in a minute. Natural selection is one of the two fundamental forces of evolution, driving evolution, that makes possible for organisms to adapt to their environments, to their conditions, to the conditions in which they live. How do we know that? We know that because it happens every day under our eyes. This picture illustrates a human T cell, this is a human blood cell, which is being attacked by these little tiny things. These little tiny things are molecules of the AIDS virus, the HIV virus that causes AIDS. The reason the AIDS virus appeared only recently in the human population is because it evolved from an ancestor that was present in chimps, in closely related chimps. The reason the AIDS virus is so effective in humans is because it was so effective in chimps, and chimps are very similar to humans. We have pretty much the same molecular machinery, we develop in pretty much the same way. Obviously we're not identical, but we're similar enough, evolutionarily speaking, and certainly from the point of view of the virus, to be common targets of the same virus. The same process of natural selection, this is the AIDS virus evolved by natural selection, which tells you right there that natural selection doesn't necessarily do good things. It does things, but not all of them are good. Another common affirmation of creationists is that evolution is a theory in crisis. And mostly they point to this man who is right off the screen. This guy here is named Stephen Jay Gould. Some of you may have heard of him. There it is. Stephen Gould is a paleontologist. That is somebody who studies fossils. He's a professor at Harvard University. He's written several popular books on evolution. Now, he has also been author of a rather controversial theory, which is called punctuated equilibria. I won't go into the details of what that is, but basically what Gould has suggested is that evolution, which is here summarized by a branching tree, you can think of the tips of these trees as different species. Okay? And what Gould has proposed is that, in fact, the evolutionary process happens in bursts and then calms down for a long time. This is a punctuated equilibrium. That is an equilibrium for most of the time. There's stasis, nothing happens. And then all of a sudden, by geological standards, all of a sudden means in a few million years. It doesn't mean from today to tomorrow, okay, or from one generation to another. It means relatively rapidly. Species change, probably in response to new environmental conditions. So this is what Gould proposed. The classical theory of evolution, on the other hand, can be seen as, in this diagram, as indicating that change is always pretty much gradual. There's never a burst anywhere. Gould is fond of baseball, and he said that evolution really looks like a baseball game. Most of the time, nothing happens. And then all of a sudden, you're there buying your hot dog, you come back, and everything happened, and you missed it. Well, that's exactly how he thinks of evolution, except that the time that it takes you to get to your hot dog is a couple of million years. Now, this theory of punctuated equilibria has been discussed since 1972, since it's been proposed. There's been empirical tests. It has withstood some of these tests and not others. So the current consensus within the evolutionary community is that they're both right some of the time. That is, in some cases, evolution actually is a very gradual and very slow process. In some other cases, by geological standard, it accelerates a little bit. But Gould, by his own reckoning, is a Darwinist. He's an evolutionary biologist. He never said that anything in his theory actually denies the theory of evolution. It's just a complement. It's just an addition to it. And that is an important point, because that, as I said, is how science works. Science is not a monolithic unit of knowledge that never changes. Okay? We find out new things. So there are things that we find out today that we didn't know when Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859. Good thing, otherwise I would be out of job. Okay? What am I being paid for? If not to uncover new things that Darwin didn't know, or that Gould doesn't know, for that matter. Okay? Another common statement by creationists, made by creationists is, unfortunately you can't read this very well, but it says, since we don't know whatever, there's a blank here, evolution must be wrong. That is, the argument is made that since evolutionary theory is not a complete theory, it doesn't explain everything, then there must be something funny about it. Again, this is a misunderstanding of the way science works. No scientific theory is ever complete. A scientific theory is a set of statements in mathematical, sometimes in mathematical form, that explain most of the reality as we understand it, and they are compatible with the empirical data as we have them. That doesn't mean that any particular theory explains everything. Okay, the theory of gravity proposed by Newton a couple of hundred years ago didn't explain everything. That's why Einstein got his theory of relativity as an improvement on Newton's theory. Okay? So the fact that something doesn't explain everything, it's not at all a good argument in favor of an alternative theory. An alternative theory has to stand on its own. It's only fair. You can't take advantage of the fact that somebody else doesn't have a complete explanation of things. Think about it. There was a time during human history in which we didn't know what caused thunder. And we thought that Zeus up on the Olympus was causing it because he was getting angry at something. Well, we know better now, okay? So the fact that we didn't know at the time, that didn't mean that meteorology was not a science or that meteorological theory was not good. At the time, wasn't good. There was no such a thing as meteorology at the time. But today, we know better. Another common statement, there are no transitional fossil forms between major groups of animals. That is simply not true. I can't believe that people actually make that statement, because it's not true. If you actually go into the literature, there is plenty of fossils. Here is an example. All of these animals over here are transitional forms from very early reptiles down here, which lived on this earth about 400, 350 million years ago, all the way up here to mammals. And these are the transitional forms. If you look at it closely, you will have to go up there, but I can give you a copy of the actual slide or point you to the reference. This is all published stuff. You will see that it's very difficult to tell where is it that the mammals start and the reptiles end. It's a continuous series. So there are plenty of fossils and intermediate fossils. How about this one? These up here that you see are the skulls of a bunch of primates. Which one is human? I bet you can't tell, partly because you can't see it. But if you could see it, that's the problem with having a large audience in a large place. But if we were in my classroom of an evolution course for the upper undergraduate level, where there are only 15 people, you would see very well. And you wouldn't be able to tell which one is which. You'll be able to tell some of these things. You can clearly tell that this guy over here, it's definitely not a human. But when you get in the middle of the group, it's a little more difficult. And the reason it's a little more difficult is because what you're looking at is your own tree of ancestry. These are your progenitors. These are your cousins. These are your sisters, and so on and so forth. From a species level, of course, not in the literal sense. Okay? And the fact that it's difficult to say where the pre-humans end and where the humans start is another thing that is perfectly in agreement with a theory of gradual change like evolution is, and natural change. Now, of course, I could keep up showing you slides after slide after slide of intermediate fossils, and somebody will come up afterwards and will say, yeah, but you didn't show the intermediate between A and B. You showed a lot about the intermediates, but not those particular. Well, of course, the fossil record is far from being complete. Fossilization is a very rare process. It takes a lot of time for things to fossilize, and it's a very unusual process. So we only have a tiny little portion of fossils, of organisms that actually survived as fossils. They didn't survive really because they're dead, but they came to us as fossils. Okay? So it's no wonder that we don't have all of the intermediates. In fact, we're not even close to having all the intermediates, but that's not what science requires. A logical explanation only requires that some of the intermediates are present and that those are in the right places. For example, why is that funny cartoon up here? What has got to do with fossils? Not much, but I'll explain in a second. Suppose that this is you over here, and you're having a conversation with a friend of yours, and then across the street you see this man walking in that direction. Now you see him over here a couple of times, okay, 1 and 2, then you resume conversing with your friend, then you turn again your head and you see him over there. Now you have at least 2 different hypotheses to explain what happened. You can think that the man was actually over here all the time while you were not looking, and all of a sudden as you turned, he jumped over there with no intermediate position. There was nothing in between. It just disappeared in one place and reappeared in another. Or, that's possible, okay? You were not looking, so you don't know. Or, you can think that, well, more likely what happened was that this person just kept walking and you simply did not observe it. And then when you turn your head, he was way far ahead, and therefore you sort of assume, reasonably enough, that in fact that there are intermediate fossils over here. You just don't happen to have seen them. That's the same situation with paleontology. Okay. If I see all the fossils in the right places, but I don't see all of the fossils, that is not a problem for the theory of evolution. You would not expect to find them all because it's an historical process which is pretty rare. But if you find them in the wrong place, now that's a problem. Okay. If you do see that man jumping over here and then over there and then back over here, then it becomes a problem. So if you really do find human fossils, for example, together with dinosaurs, which never happened, contrary to the claim of some creationists, then you'll be in trouble. Because we know that dinosaurs existed much earlier than humans. Okay? So there is a way to falsify the theory of evolution, to demonstrate that it's wrong, except that so far it hasn't happened. It could happen tomorrow. And if it does, I'll come back here and tell you. How can a random process such as evolution explain complexity? Well, that would take a whole lecture in and of itself, and besides, not many scientists are even sure of what complexity is. There is a lot of discussion in science of what is it that we consider complex? How do you measure complexity? But by and large, you know, a human being is certainly more complex than a bacterium. There is not much question about that. So how do we explain that? Well, evolution is the result of at least 2 different processes. One of which is mutation, the appearance of new variants in the population, okay? Things that look different from what was there before. Mutations are caused by changes in the DNA, in the information molecule that actually forms human beings and everything else that is living. That process truly is random. Mutations do occur at random. However, there is a second component to the evolutionary change, and that is natural selection. Natural selection is a process by which some of those variants survive and produce offspring, and some don't, or some produce fewer offspring than others. By that process of successive elimination, Some variants, some mutations become dominant in a population and others go extinct. That process is definitely not random because it depends on survival of the individual that carries that mutation. If that mutation carries an increase in the fitness of that individual, and there are beneficial mutations, I can demonstrate them to you. I generate them almost every day in my lab. There are mutations that are beneficial. There are a lot of mutations that are not beneficial. But nevertheless, it's the combination of these two processes, one of which is non-random and the other one is random, that creates complexity. So evolution is not the result of a random process. Therefore, when creationists say something like evolution is equivalent to a tornado going into a junkyard, through a junkyard, and creating all of a sudden a jumbo jet out of that mess, that's not true. Because that will be a truly random phenomenon. There is no natural selection there, okay? So this is not an accurate representation of evolution. It just doesn't work that way, and if you say it works that way, that means you don't understand how evolution actually works. Organisms are so complex that they must have been designed. The argument from design has been around a long time, and of course it makes intuitive sense. It appeals to people. It was, as you probably know, actually originated way before Darwin by William Paley, who was a pastor in England. And he simply noticed that if you go around on the beach and you find a watch, you immediately deduce from the existence of that watch that there was a watchmaker. Similarly, the argument goes, if there is a designed organism, an organism that clearly has been designed to, for example, swim in the water or fly in the air, then there must have been a designer. That argument is fallacious because there's two ways to get a design. There is an artificial, intelligent design. Indeed, it is true that watches are created by humans. There is no question about it. And then there is natural design. Natural design is recognizable from artificial design because usually it's far from being perfect. Okay? All the parts don't work together as they're supposed to work in an ideal world. And you find the hallmarks, you find the clues that tell you that actually that was a gradual process. It happened little by little. It didn't just pop into existence. If you look at watches do pop into existence. You don't find intermediate fossils for the watches. You see the watch that is completely functional. Before that, it's in the fabric, in the factory. Okay, you don't see it. But if you look at the fossil record, or if you compare different organisms living today, you do see intermediates. For example, this is the evolution, highly summarized, this is a brief history, of the evolution of the eye, which is one of those structures that creationists say couldn't possibly be the result of a natural process. Well, these are the eyes seen in section of several different organisms. This is the eye, the very simple eye of a gastropod named Patella. It's a kind of it's a flat snail. This is the eye of a worm who is smiling right here off the screen. This is the eye, it's a little bit more round. It's the eye of another kind of gastropod, like the nautilus, which has a coiled shape. This eye is typical of shelled mollusks. And you can see now that it starts looking a lot more like an advanced version of the eye, which is like the human eye. And then finally down here, this kind of eye really looks a lot like the human eye, and it is present in squids and in fishes. And in fact, it's not very different from the human eye. Now, if you look at the human eye, isolated from everything else, you'll say, well, how did that happen? But if you look at this sequence, this is exactly what you would expect if this was the result of a natural phenomenon. But recently, some creationists, like Dr. Michael Behe, who is a biochemist, like Dr. Gish, published a book. He published a book called Darwin's Black Box, in which he said, yeah, fine, we now understand how the eye evolved. He did grant that much in that book. But he said, when you get to the molecular level, things are just simply too complex. Molecules, biomolecules, are simply too complicated. He called this phenomenon irreducible complexity. That is, you get to the bottom line and there's just no way to get a molecule of DNA or a protein or whatever else out by natural means. Well, what you're looking at here are three molecules that are present in living organisms. These are 3 amino acids. And you can see that the chemical structure is very similar And you can think of these as intermediates. You can see how easily you can change one amino acid over here into another one, and this thing has quit on me, over there at the center. Okay. So there are intermediates also at the molecular level. It is not true that there is no way to get molecules by natural means. Evolution violates the second principle of thermodynamics. I'm sure we'll hear this again tonight. No, it doesn't. The second principle of thermodynamics, which is a very well-established principle in physics, simply says that disorder, the amount of disorder in a system, which physicists call entropy, has to increase in the universe at large or in a closed system. A closed system is a system that is isolated from everything else, that doesn't have any energy or materials coming into the system. Well, the reason that evolution can create order, that is, organisms become complex, organisms are very ordered things, okay? There is a very high level of order inside each one of us. Our entropy, from a physicist's point of view, is very low. The reason we can do that is because we live in a planet that is not a closed system at all. The Earth is not a closed system. The Earth receives materials, the biosphere receives materials from the rest of the Earth, and the Earth itself receives energy from outside of the planet, from the sun mostly. Okay? So, since those assumptions of the second principle are violated by the biosphere, there is no contradiction between the existence of a biosphere and the evolution of a biosphere, the evolution of organisms, and the second principle. If you go that way, if you still insist that there is a distinction there, it's really a bit like saying that a bird defies the law of gravity because it can fly. Well, technically, yes, it does, okay? Because it keeps going way up there, while in fact it should come down because it's heavier than air. So technically it does, but in reality it doesn't. And the reason it doesn't is because the bird, if you want, is cheating. It's using energy to flap his wings and be up there. As soon as he stops flapping his wings, you can guarantee that the law of gravity will take over and go down. Similarly, until you and the rest of the biosphere keep eating, you're alive. At one point, your system, however, cannot keep up with the increased disorder inside your cells. Your cells and your DNA slowly degrade because of the second law of thermodynamics. And eventually you'll die. From a physicist's point of view, I took a course in biophysics once, and the biophysics professor told me that from a physicist's point of view, death is a sudden increase in entropy. Okay? All of a sudden you become very disordered. Evolution is the root of evil. I'm sure you have heard this argument before. I don't know what you mean by the root of evil. Evil is a pretty complicated thing, and as you might know, different people have different ideas of what is evil and what is not evil. However, I will attract your attention to a couple of facts. First of all, evil has been around a lot more than Darwin has. So you can't blame evil just on the fact that somebody published a book in 1859. It's also hard to demonstrate that evil increased after the publication of The Origin of Species. It's how do you measure evil anyway? Okay. It's a very difficult argument to make. But suppose that there were negative consequences or even evil consequences of the theory of evolution. So what? The theory doesn't have anything to do with ethics. It's not a guidance to morality. It's just an explanation of how things work. So by the same token, should we abandon the atomic theory because a result of the atomic theory was the atomic bomb? I would argue that the atomic bomb is much more evil than a lot of other stuff that has been attributed to evolution. But that doesn't make the atomic theory wrong. The atomic theory is just the atomic theory. It works. And in fact, one of the demonstrations that it works is that we did get the atomic bomb and it works. Okay? Now, the use of what we make out of that theory is entirely up to us, and we can be capable of good things or evil things. But the thing itself doesn't have any evil intrinsically. It just is. Science is just another religion. Creationist Philip Johnson has been fond of saying that over and over. He's published a couple of books lately in which he claims that that is the case. Well, how do you define religion then? If you look it up in any dictionary, the definitions of science and religion are very, very different. And if you ask a lot of people, they will probably agree that the two things are quite different. I'm not saying one is better than the other. The two really don't address the same problem anyway. Okay? Science, as I said before, doesn't have anything to do directly with morality. Scientists can be moral or immoral, okay, evil or good, but science per se is neutral from that point of view. Well, there is a rundown there of the differences between religion and science. All religions, we're not talking just about the Christian religion, are based on an immutable doctrine. By definition, it's a matter of faith, okay? Science is a self-correcting mechanism. In science, there is such a thing as peer review. You have to convince other people that you're right. And you're always questioned. Even after you publish, somebody else can publish another paper that demonstrates that your work was bogus. It can happen at any time, even after you're dead. There's no rest, okay, for a scientist. So one is based on faith, the other one is based on evidence. Those are completely distinct processes. No scientist believes in everything just because somebody else tells him, or because it's written somewhere. I want the evidence. And as far as the natural world is concerned, that is the way to go. As far as spiritual matters and ethical matters, this is a different question. How can you use evidence to address spiritual and ethical matters? It's a completely different discussion. But what we're discussing here tonight is evidence about the natural world. Religion is taught on authority and on revealed word. Science is a peer review process, and it's based on hypothesis testing. Every time that you propose an hypothesis or a theory, somebody is going to go out there and test it. So they are very different. Science negates the existence of God. This is a very touchy matter, and we are in a church over here, so I'm under no impression that people here don't see a connection between those two things. Of course you do. Is there such a connection? Well, yes and no. There are some things that are in the scriptures of almost every religion that can be refuted by scientific evidence. That does not, in and of itself, refute those religions. The two are distinct. In other words, if you make a precise statement, like all the animals on the earth survived the flood because of Noah's Ark, well, that's a precise statement. In fact, it's very precise because the Bible, as you know, actually reports the exact size of the ark. And it describes how the process actually occurred. Well, not only there is no scientific evidence that that is actually the case, that actually happened, but it is a scientific impossibility. You just cannot fit the whole biosphere in an ark of that size. When people wrote that at that time, they didn't know much about biodiversity. They didn't know that the biosphere today is made of more than 3 million species. They didn't know anything about ecology. They didn't know how to keep separate, or that it's not possible to keep separate predators from prey. And there are a lot of other problems. How you recycle the stuff that these predators and prey produce. You can actually do the calculations and you'll see that they just don't add up. So science denies that particular story. Does that mean that the whole thing has to be thrown away? Of course not. It only means that if you interpret that particular story literally, as opposed to metaphorically, then you're in trouble. Because then you're making a specific statement that science can actually go out there and test. Okay? But if you don't, then there is no problem. No scientist is going to come up, no serious scientist at least, should come up here and say science denies the existence of God. That doesn't make any sense. It is not an empirical fact. Okay? So there is a distinction there. What is creation science anyway? We're talking about evolutionary theory versus creation science, but creation science is a lot of different things depending on who is talking. You can see up there Dr. Gish on the left, not just on my left, but on the picture. Michael Behe down there is the biochemist who wrote Darwin's Black Box, and I'm sure you recognize the Pope over on the right. They subscribe to 3 very different creation theories. Okay? Dr. Gish thinks that the Earth is actually about 6,000 years old, at least the last time that I checked his writings. Michael Behe doesn't have any problem whatsoever with evolution occurring at the morphological level, that is, changes in the appearance of organisms, and he doesn't have any problem whatsoever in recognizing evolution as a process over millions of years. The Pope goes even further, and he says in his last statement on the matter a couple of years ago that he has no problem whatsoever with evolution except for human evolution, for some portions of human evolution, when it comes down to the soul. Okay? Which, of course, is an argument that evolutionary biologists don't address. Evolution doesn't study the origin of the soul. You can't measure it, so you can't study it. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It just means you cannot study it scientifically. So creation science is actually not at all a monolithic or a coherent set body of knowledge. Now, if you think that the difference between Stephen Gould and other evolutionary biologists that I mentioned before is a great difference, here is a lot larger. So it sounds funny to me when creationists accuse evolutionary theory of being in disarray because of what are really minor modifications on the same team, when in fact they cannot agree if the Earth is 6,000 or 6 billion years old. There is a lot of orders of magnitude of difference there. This is not just a matter of details. There are, of course, also things that creationists directly don't explain. Creation theory just simply cannot explain or has a hard time explaining. One of them is, why did 99% of all species that ever lived on Earth disappear? They go extinct. The most likely thing that can happen to a species is to go extinct. They did not disappear all at one time, so you cannot invoke the flood. We know that they disappear at different times. In fact, there were several catastrophes, which are called mass extinctions, and then there are several other millions of other instances in which species just die down. Why does that happen? Evolutionary theory predicts that that should be the case because it is a result of what Darwin called the struggle for existence. In a struggle for existence, some people lose and some people win. Some species win, some species lose. So when you lose as a species, you're not just dead, you're extinct. So that's exactly what evolutionary theory predicts. But why, from a creationist point of view, should there be 99% of species that ever existed go extinct? Another thing that creationist doesn't explain is the highly imperfect way in which living organisms are put together. And humans in particular. If you think of ourselves as high pinnacle of evolution, well, maybe so. But there are a lot of things that are wrong with us. For example, we get hemorrhoids, varicose veins, backaches, and babies, like my daughter over there, she's Callie, she's now 2.5 years old. Babies take a long time to learn to walk, about a year. Why? Is there any explanation in creation theory for that kind of events, for that kind of observations? I couldn't find any. It's an easy explanation from an evolutionary biologist. The reason for all of those things is because we're not well designed to stand up here on 2 legs. Because most of our ancestors actually were curved or used 4 limbs. We evolved as bipedal organisms only very recently, and we're not very well designed at it, which you would expect if our evolution was the result of a natural process. We're doing okay, but we get backaches. Okay. Another thing that creationist doesn't explain, creationist does not attack only evolutionary theory. It attacks a lot of other things. In fact, basically the whole of science is denied by creation scientists. For example, if the Earth actually originated 6,000 years ago and not 5 billion years ago, then there must be something seriously wrong with the current origins of the origin of the solar system, which are at the basis of current astronomy and cosmology. Now the question is, what is wrong with it? Why? There's plenty of evidence on the astronomical side for that kind of conclusion. If you deny it, you can't just say, no, it didn't happen. You have to explain why it didn't happen, why do you think it's wrong, and what do you propose as an alternative explanation. Another thing the creationist doesn't explain. Geological strata were not formed by sedimentary processes over millions of years. Well, if they were not, how do you explain the existence of sedimentary strata worldwide? Sedimentary strata are those big chunks of rocks that were deposited, according to geologists, okay, over millions and millions of years. You're looking at the Grand Canyon right there. Some people are thinking that the answer is the flood. It is not. If you do the calculations, it just doesn't add up. There's no way something like the flood could have created the Grand Canyon. You can ask any geologist if you don't trust me. I'm not a geologist, I just trust them. Okay? But there's perfect agreement within the geological community that that's not the way it happened. Now, if you disagree, you're perfectly fine, you have the right to disagree, but you have to propose an alternative explanation, because now you're throwing out evolutionary biology, which is the major theory in biology, you're throwing out astronomy and cosmology, and you're throwing out geology. You're going to get into trouble one of these days. For example, another kind of trouble, you get in trouble with physicists. Okay? Creationists deny that radioactive elements decay in a clockwise fashion, that is, little by little, on a regular basis, in a regular pattern. That decay, that is, the idea is that a particular radioactive element, for example, uranium-237, decays over time into another form of uranium and eventually over other forms of other elements. That decay, that radioactive decay, is used by geologists and by paleontologists, therefore by biologists, to actually measure the age of rocks. Because the ages of a rock can be measured directly by the proportion between these two kinds of elements, or more than two kinds of elements, that you find inside them. Since you know what the clock, how fast the clock ticks, basically, so how long it takes for one kind of element to transform entirely in another one, you just have to measure the two kinds, and you can reconstruct the whole curve, which tells you pretty much how old that rock is. Now, this is a beautiful theory, which is based on the atomic theory. If you don't believe that, you're fine, but you have to propose an alternative for the atomic theory, and that alternative better be capable of explaining a lot of other things that the atomic theory explains, including making the atomic bomb. Why are there so many different creation stories? That is another thing that creation science does not explain. Okay, let's assume that we go with the story as it is in Genesis, literally. Okay? Well, why that and not something else? There are other creation stories. For example, the world was created from the parts of a slain monster, according to the Indo-Chinese, the Korean, and the Greeks. The world was generated from an egg, according to Japanese, Samoans, Finnish, and Hindu legends. And there was no creation whatsoever. The world has always existed, according to Jainism traditions of India. Now, why believe one and not the other? Well, the answer is, of course, I believe this and not another on the basis of faith. And you're fine if you stop at that. But that's not a scientific answer at all. You have to provide reasons. Reasons that are external to the thing that you believe that as a matter of faith. Because otherwise, other things being equal, I can pick any other one of these myths or legends or stories and believe one of those. What is the criterion? The criterion is facts, hypothesis testing. That's what science is all about. That's why we actually don't believe any of these things, and we have a better explanation of how the world came to be. Why don't we teach both theories? This is a very controversial and very delicate matter which needs to be addressed. It sounds logical, and it appeals to the sense of fairness of most people. Well, okay, you may have a good argument about this thing, but if there is another argument out there, why don't we teach both in our public schools? Because education, and I don't want you to misunderstand me when I say that, it is not a democratic process. What I mean by that? You don't teach by majority vote. You teach the best of our understanding of how things are. And as I said, that understanding can change, and therefore that teaching can change. But you don't take a poll. You don't go into a classroom and say, okay, should we teach today that the earth is flat or round? Let's see how many people believe that it's flat. It's a majority. Okay, today the earth is flat. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way in any other discipline. I don't see why it should work that way in evolutionary theory. The specialists, the professionals, the people that spend most of their lives studying these things tell you that, well, yeah, there is a very good theory, and so far it's the only theory we got. There were other theories before, by the way. There are other ways of explaining. There were other ways, scientific ways of explaining modifications of organisms on Earth. The Lamarckian theory of evolution, for example, was very different from from Darwin. It was proven to be wrong. It was possible. It just didn't work. That's why we teach that. We teach Darwin and not Lamarck today. So, in conclusion, and I think I am below the 1 hour mark, the take-home message from all of this is that I don't have all of the truths. I don't have all of the answers. I have some of the answers, and most of those answers are tentative anyway. But the point of all these exercises is for you to think. A French philosopher, René Descartes, put it very nicely 3 centuries ago. He said, cogito ergo sum, which in Latin sounds grand, but it simply means I think, therefore I am. That is, the thing in Descartes' mind that made a human being was the fact that he was thinking. Thinking means questioning. You can question everybody. You can question me, obviously. That's why I'm here tonight. You should question Dr. Gish. You should question anybody else that tells you to believe something on the basis of no evidence. Ask for the evidence. Just the facts, ma'am. Where is the evidence? Where are the facts? Why do you interpret these facts this way and not the other? There will be questions tonight, possibly, that I will not be able to answer, and I will simply say, I don't know. The fact that I don't know doesn't mean that somebody else automatically knows better. It is possible that somebody else knows better, of course. But it doesn't mean that automatically that's the case. Therefore, I will tilt around Descartes' dictum and say, in a more Darwinian sense, that I am, therefore I think. And I will thank you for your attention, and I'll give the time to Dr. Gish.
Well, I've certainly enjoyed this presentation by Dr. Pigliucci. He has explained in a very rational and reasonable way this notion of evolution and how he thinks and what he believes about the nature of science. And about the nature of science, the true nature of science, I could not add much more to what he has said. But he didn't quite explain everything about science as it relates to origins. Now, first of all, I want to thank the sponsors of this occasion, the church here and its pastor. I want to thank John Dowdy, who has spent much time and effort in arranging all these details. He spent many weeks on that, and we're very grateful for this opportunity. I'm grateful to have this opportunity to present to you why I, as a scientist, have become convinced that scientific evidence related to origins provides very powerful support to creation, a supernatural origin, and why it is actually incompatible with evolutionary theory. Now, let us discuss, first of all, the nature of science. Now, Dr. Pigliucci has done this, but he left it incomplete. Now, it is true that as scientists, when we try to observe and understand and explain how the universe operates, how the sun produces its energy, how do we explain the orbits of comets, how do we explain our biochemistry, our physiology, we use only natural laws and processes to do that. How else can a scientist operate? So science is our attempt to understand what's out there, what's here in this real world now. That's science. Biology. What does the word biology mean? It's the study of living organisms. That is biology. Evolution has to do with their supposed history. Now, scientific hypotheses and theories, I think he has explained that very well. They are ideas. They are notions. The attempt to explain how things operate.